Okay, in this video, I am going to show you how to create a bar graph, or a few different kinds of a bar graph that are pretty common. So to start off with, let's say that we want a bar graph really that just summarizes the mean of some variable. So what you'll see here is I already have Stata loaded. I've already got data uploaded in here, so we're ready to go to start working with it. And let's say, just for example, that we want to do is what we want to get is school enrollment, that's really what we're interested in. So this data set is school level data. It's a statewide data set. And so let's say what we want to do is we want to see the average school level enrollment across the state. So one way to do this, again, just making a bar graph. So we start with the graph command down here. So we say graph bar, then we're going to use this total enrollment variable, which is the total enrollment for each school. And then we can just hit enter, and then we're going to get a bar graph, just kind of, a standard bar graph. Along the y-axis, what we're going to see is the label for this particular variable, this variable is total enrollment, and it's telling us that this is the average. So the average is between 500 and 600. If you want, you can specify a bunch more options by going into the easiest way to do that is probably just use the help command. Or what you can do is if you want to make some tweaks to this, you can just go to the graph editor here, click that, and now what you can do is you can add shapes, you can add text, you can do all kinds of other things here. So those are two ways that you might be able to, you can tweak the graph to get it to show something a little bit more specific. So that's how we showed a bar graph, or how we generate a bar graph for one variable, and it's going to be, we're just getting an average across the whole data set. You can add multiple variables if you want. So let's say that in addition to total enrollment, let's say that we want to look at the percentage of students, economically disadvantaged students. So now we're going to get another bar graph. And what you'll see here is it's just added another bar. So each variable gets its own bar. So the blue bar here is going to be the total enrollment variable. The red bar here is going to be the percentage of students who are economically disadvantaged. Something to keep in mind if you're going to be doing something like this, in that you want multiple bars for different variables, is really keep in mind the scale that you're using. What I mean by that is the scale, meaning like how is that variable measured, kind of what's the range and so forth, because in this case, total enrollment is a count. That variable is, well, one school has 212 students, another school has 816 students, and so on. Versus this other variable, which is the percentage of students who are economically disadvantaged, that's constrained to be between 0 and 100. And so when we put both of those variables on the same graph, this economically disadvantaged students variable looks to be quite small because it can only have a maximum of 100. So this might not be a very useful graph because in order to accommodate the mean for this total enrollment variable, we have to have a very large y-axis. And because of the scale for this other variable, the percentage of economically disadvantaged students, it sort of makes it look artificially small. So if we were to do that and just make a graph that shows the mean of economically disadvantaged students, then we get something that's a lot more useful. So right here we can see how it's an average of somewhere on the order of 36, 37%, something like that, versus with the other graph, that was much harder to see. So this would be how you make a bar graph in Stata when you want to show just the average for some variable. So the next kind of bar graph that people might want to show is where where you want to show conditional means. So this would be, let's say that I want to see whether total enrollment, school level enrollment varies across counties within this particular state. So what I want is something very similar to our first graph, except that instead of one bar that summarizes the whole state, says what's the average enrollment for the entire state, I want a graph that shows enrollment, the average enrollment, but I want different bars for each county in that state. So we'll start with the same bar graph. And then what we want to do is just use this over option. And so then what we're going to do is, so we've got we're telling Stata this is a bar graph. I want a bar graph of this variable, and I want separate bars for each county. So I'm going to use the county code variable here. And now what you can see is that now we have a separate line, separate bar for each county within our data set. The scale over here, the y-axis, is pretty much the same. And what we can see is, as you might expect, there are more urban counties where there are schools tend to be larger, have more students, and then there are others that are probably more rural counties where their students, that have fewer students on average. So what you'll see here is, if you look at the way that Stata constructed our graph, the text is all overlapping, which is not really what we want. We would like to be able to see the name of the county, right? And there are different ways that we can do that. I'll show you quickly probably the easiest way to do that. So you can change what we want to do is change the angle of that text so that you can read it. So what we can do is we can just click Start Graph Editor. And then the easiest thing to do is let's just double click these labels. So then what we want to do is go to Label Properties. So we've got Show Label On. Now let's say we just want to angle it. So let's say we want to angle that text at a 45 degrees. So now we've got, I'll just move these dialog boxes over off to the side. And so you can see that it changed the text, and now it's a little bit more legible. Right? You can see that here's the bar graph showing this size of the average school in Atlantic County. Over here, size of the average school in Ocean County. If we wanted to, we can also change that angle to be completely vertical. If this is a little bit easier than having everything at a 45 degree. So it just depends on what it is that you would want. You can also do this with code. Like if you're going to be running a bunch of these kinds of graphs, there are options that you should look up to just tell it to arrange the text like this by default. But if you're just running one graph, then jumping into the graph editor is a pretty simple and straightforward way of doing this. And then you can just say, click OK, and now you're ready to go. Before you do much of anything, you'll want to turn off the graph editor. And now you've got something that if you wanted to, you can just copy and just copy this whole thing and paste it into some other document that you're working on. And then the same thing goes here. If we were to say, put this other variable in, we'll get something again that is kind of problematic and troubled to read. So in this case, we're able to see, yes, there's variation in this percentage of economically disadvantaged students across county, but because the scale is so much shorter, it's constrained to be a maximum of 100. It's really hard to kind of make sense of these. So again, probably better to put these into a different graph. All right, and so that is how we can make a couple different kinds of the standard sorts of bar graphs that you might want to generate using Stata.